Let's install Ubuntu Server. First thing we need to do is download the software. So I'm here at ubuntu.com/download/server. And you have three options. The first option is multipass, which gives you on-demand virtual machines that you can run on Mac, Windows, or Linux platforms. And option two, where you can do automated setup of systems and do that with Ubuntu Server, but then you can run on demand other stuff. And the third option, where we do a manual install, which is what I'm doing in this video, where we actually download the software. So it's easy to get. You just click on it and download the Ubuntu Server ISO image. It's about 1 gig. I've already done that, and I've already created a virtual machine, and I'm ready to start that installation. But you can use whatever virtualization platform you want. I have videos on virtualization and how to use virtual platforms elsewhere. This is just a video on the installation of Ubuntu. You should also know the minimum requirements. And if you take a look here, I'm at ubuntu.com/server/docs/installation. And we are installing Ubuntu 20.04 server. And you can see the recommended requirements here. 1 gigahertz CPU, 1 gigabyte of RAM, and 2.5 gigabytes of drive space. So that's not that much. I usually do a considerable amount more, just in case I'm going to be doing more with the server. Quite often I'll use 2 CPU cores in a virtual system, or just call it 2 CPUs, 2 gigs of RAM, and like a 10 gigabyte drive space. Because usually I'm going to be working with other software. But these are the bare minimums that you can get away with, I should say. Okay, so make sure you know your requirements and grab the software. I've already done that. I've already created the virtual machine, and I started the virtual machine, and it booted from the ISO image and started the installation of Ubuntu. So this is the beginning of the install here. Let's go through it. First thing is to check the language that you're using. I'm using English, so I'm going to press Enter to continue. And then we have to select, what do we want to do? Install Ubuntu Server, install it with safe graphics, test our memory, which is a good idea if you're going to do this on a physical system, or boot from your first hard disk, your hard drive, if you want to get away from this. But we just want to install Ubuntu Server, so we'll select that, press Enter, and get the installation started. Okay, so that's going to create public and private key pairs so that we can work with SSH, because this is a server system. It's understood that we're probably not going to be working locally at this system. We're going to want to SSH into it. So it's creating those key pairs for that right now. All right, so now it's asking what language are we using? It is English. I'm going to press Enter for that for me. And then it tells us version 20.09 of the installer is now available. We're doing 20.04. I'm going to stick with 20.04 LTS. You may want to read up on the differences between LTS and newer versions, but I'm sticking with the LTS version here. I'm going to continue without updating. So I'm going to press Enter. And it says keyboard layout, all English is good. I'm going to press Enter for done. And then it's time to configure the network interface. Well, automatically, this looks for a DHCP IP address. You might not want to do that. Many servers will work with static IPs, but it depends. Depends on what you're doing. DHCP might be good for you. I'm going to tab over to that section. And the name of the network interface is ENP1S0. That's an Ethernet connection. If I want to change how that will be set up, I can press Enter and then arrow down to Edit IP version 4, press Enter, and then I can change the IP version 4 method from DHCP to static. So if I press Enter, we can go to Manual. Press Enter for that. And so, for example, what I might do is tab down and say, okay, I want this guy to have a specific IP address. Not .116, maybe something else. Let's say I wanted it to be 10.0.2 .56 or something like that. Well, the first thing I have to do is know what the network number will be. And for me, that's going to be 10.0.2.0/24. That is the network number or the subnet that I'll be working off of. Then we'll tab down to address. The actual address that I'll want to use is 10.0.2.56. Let's say that as an example, instead of the 116. Then I need the gateway address, which is 10.0.2.1, and the DNS server, 10.0.2.1. Now that's just for my network. Your network may be different. You might be on a different subnet with a different gateway and a different DNS server. And then search domains, I'm going to leave that blank, but you might set up something as like example.com, something like that. Okay. I'm actually going to remove this though. I actually want this to be DHCP. But if you were setting this up in the field, you would probably do it here. This is where I would normally do it, is set it up as static here right from the beginning. But I'm going to leave it as DHCP for now. And we'll configure it as static within the system. So I can show that within the networking of Ubuntu. Okay. So we'll go down to cancel because I'm not really making any changes here. And you'll see underneath, we can also create a bond. And that's going to be common if you have multiple network interfaces, and many servers do. You might have 2 or 4 RJ45s on the back of your server, of a physical server, and you might want to combine those interfaces together. You might want to use them in a fault-tolerant method, and so on. You could do that by selecting each one. I only have one here because this is a virtual machine, but you would select each of the devices there. And then you would select what type of bonding you want to do. If you want to balance out the traffic between the different network interfaces, or if you want to have something that's fault tolerant, you want to use the aggregate bandwidth and so on. So you'd have to select the right one. That's a whole nother concept altogether. So we're going to leave that as is. I'm going to cancel out of here, and I'm not going to do any bonding and just leave that. But that's something you would definitely be interested in if you're setting up a real server. So I'm leaving it as DHCP and no bonding, and I'm going to tab down to done and press enter. Okay, proxy address. If you have a proxy server, you would need to enter that here. In a lot of cases, you won't, but you never know. You might have a proxy server that you're going through for a variety of reasons, including security purposes. So you'd have to enter that here. I'm not using one, so I'm going to press enter for done. And then mirror address. Where do we want to grab additional content for the installation? By default, this is providing me us.archive.ubuntu.com, and that's fine, but you can provide a different archive if you want to. Usually it picks the right one for your area. So we'll press enter for done. Now it's saying configure guided storage layout. Okay. I'm going to use the entire disk. I don't want to do a custom storage layout. I just want a basic drive for this virtual machine where everything's stored in one directory within / basically. But if you're setting up a server, it's a good idea to have separate directories. You're going to want to set up the EFI separately, and you're going to want to have the home directory in a separate partition, and so on. So that's something to think about. But again, we're just doing a basic installation here. And this will be installing this. I'm actually using a 20 gigabyte partition, which is a lot for what we're doing here. And it's going to go to /dev/VDA because this is a virtual drive. So that's fine. Just going to tab down to done and leave it as entire disk. Press enter. And it shows the mount point at the top, which is /. That's where everything's going to go into. It's 20 gig. It's going to be an ext4 partition, which is fine for our purposes here. And then down below, you'll see the partitions. You see BIOS, grub. So we have our grub partition, which is very small. And then we have the rest of the drive, which will be partition 2, which is ext4, and it will be where all the data is stored. So that's fine. Going to press enter for done. And it says, hey, if you continue, it's going to erase everything on this drive. Well, this is a virtual drive. There's nothing on there just yet. I just created it. So that's fine. arrow down to continue, and press enter. But of course, you want to be sure before you start any installation like this. Be sure not to install to a partition that already has any data on it that you might need. So press enter. Now we're going to pick a username. And so you would pick whatever name you want, but I'm just going to keep it simple and leave it as user. And that's going to be my username as well. I mean, you could do whatever you want here. It could be, you know, I could be Dave Prowse, whatever, but I'm just going to leave this simple. It's just a testing machine. User is fine. Server's name. We'll call this Ubuntu-server-2004. So I know what it is right in the command line every time I'm working with it. Tab down, pick a username, just going to be user, and a password. Always remember to pick complex passwords and confirm it. Tab to done and press enter. Next, you can choose to install OpenSSH server so that we can enable secure remote access to the server. Well, this is generally how I connect to servers. I will use OpenSSH or another SSH tool so that I can connect right from the command line from my workstation. But that's going to all depend on the policies of your company and what you need to do. You could always choose to install a separate SSH program. You can also choose to import SSH identities if you have them stored, for example, at GitHub. I'm not doing that though, because I'm going to be using just a regular logon and using the password for this. In the field, I would create a public-private key pair to do this. But we're going to leave it as the default. We are installing OpenSSH. We'll go down to done and press enter. Here we have a lot of server snaps or programs that you can install. Lots of great stuff that you may want to work with. I'm not installing any of these today, but I mean, there's some great stuff here. Like you could set up a Nextcloud server. You can install Docker. You could install PowerShell if you wanted to actually have PowerShell on the Linux side. And if you're working with Windows systems in conjunction, AWS, command line interface, and so on. There's a lot of good stuff here. I'm not installing any right now, but something to take a look at and consider when you do your installation. So we'll tab down to done, press enter. And that's going to go ahead and do our installation. It's actually been running installation in the background. And now it's going to go and download and install security updates, which we do want. And so that'll take a little bit. I'm going to view the full log here, see exactly what's going on here. Okay. All right, so that'll take a minute. So I'm going to pause the video and come back when this is complete. Okay, so that actually took several minutes, and it could be longer or shorter depending on the speed of your system and other factors. But I'm in the full installer output here, and you can see at the bottom it says all upgrades have been installed. It did take several minutes. And let me click in here. We'll close out of the full installer output. That brings us back here. And at this point, we can reboot because the installation is complete. So arrow down to reboot, press enter. There we go. And if you're wondering, the virtualization system I'm using for this install is KVM. But I'm looking for all good OKs here. Everything that's been green so far, I believe. Okay. All right. And we're at the login. It's actually doing some additional stuff here, though, so we'll let that go. Okay, we've got Cloud Init, we've got Secure Shell, and so on. All right, press enter so we can do the login. So I'm going to log in as the account that I created, and that is user. Press enter, type in the password that I used. Okay, good stuff. All right, and so it's telling us welcome. And it says that 98 updates can be installed immediately. I'm not going to do those updates right now, but that's something you may want to consider. All right, and I'm connected as user, so I don't have administrative capabilities yet. And it tells you at the bottom to run a command as administrator, meaning the user root, then you want to use sudo and the command. Before any command that you'd run, you'd preface it with sudo. Another option, if you want to get in as root, is to do a sudo-i, then type the password for the user, whatever password you selected. That'll get you in as root. But now you've effectively activated the root account, so you want to make sure you have a password for that. So we'll type in passwd, and I'll type in a password, a complex one for the root account, and retype it. There we go. So now root has been updated. All right, good stuff. So the print is pretty small here. My apologies. But when you're working in a console, that's normal. There's a variety of ways to change the look of the console, and I have other videos for that. If you're interested, take a look at my site. But another option is to SSH in from a client. So I could work from my main system here and SSH into that computer. First thing I want to know, though, is what is the IP address of this system. So I'm going to do an IP space A, and we'll see here at the bottom it says 10.0.2.116. So that's what I could connect as when I SSH in. Okay, so I do an SSH user at 10.0.2.116. Press enter. And it says, well, we can't tell if this host is authentic. Here's the fingerprint for it, generated with ECDSA. Are you sure you want to continue? Yes, I am. And I have to type in the password of the user account. And now we're in. If I want to extend my privileges to the root account, log in as root, I could do a su dash and type in the password of the root account that I just set up at the system. All right, so now I can see everything a little bit better and work with my mouse and all that. And here's the IP address for the server. So I'm SSH'd into the server right now. I can do anything I need to do on that server. And so, for example, I mentioned before, this server is getting a dynamic IP. You might do that with your server, but many servers, the majority of servers, are set up statically. So I need to change that. In Ubuntu server, we use netplan to configure our TCP IP, right? So we need to find the configuration file for that. So we're going to go to cd/etc or etc/netplan and press enter. Inside there, you'll see a YAML file, a single YAML file that has the configuration for a network interface. So I'm going to configure that now. And I like to use Vim for my configurations, but you can use other editors if you want. So I'm going to do a Vim 00 tab complete it and press enter. All right, so here is the network config that was written automatically by the operating system. And you can see here it is set to DHCP true. I don't want that. I want it set to static. This is the network interface name. And that's something you need to know. If I get out of here and go back to that IPA command that I showed, we see it here, ENP1S0. Your name may vary. So let's go back in there. That's the network interface card that I want to work with. Now in servers, you'll probably have multiple network interface cards. So you have to know which one you're working with and which one you want to change, and be very careful with that type of thing. But I want to remove DHCP and change it to static. And there's a couple ways to do that. First of all, this is written in YAML. So if you haven't worked with YAML before, you want to make sure that your syntax is correct. So I'm going to press I to insert, since we're working in Vim. And I'm going to remove this DHCP information. But underneath that ENP1S0 network interface, I'm going to add a section called addresses, : okay, and we don't need be that far out. Okay, so addresses, then press enter. And what are the addresses going to be? Well, I'm just going to have one static address. We'll put a dash space 10.0.2.53 I want for this server, /24 for the net mask. Press enter. What is the gateway address going to be? We need to have a gateway address. I'm going to call it gateway 4, and that's going to be 10.0.2.1. Then we'll go down and press enter. And then we want name servers for DNS, That'll automatically tab it over 1 when I press enter. You could have a search for a specific domain if you wanted to. And for example, we could do example.com in square brackets. But the search is not necessary. You may want it, but it's not necessary. If we want internet access and name resolution connectivity, then we'd have to have a DNS server. We would type in addresses, and then type in the address of our DNS server. So we do a dash 10.0.2.1. Okay. And we could fix this up a little bit. We could make this a little bit nicer because it's not really lined up so great, but it's okay as is, and it should work. We're showing we're using version 2 of the net plan, which is what we want. If you were using DHCP, sometimes you'll get some errors. And one of the things you might need to add is renderer : network D, because that's the service, that's the networking service that Ubuntu utilizes. That's the backend for NetPlan. You can leave that here for a static setup also. That's not really going to matter. I'm going to leave it for now. And so this is a typical setup here for working with NetPlan. It could be that you want to have multiple IP addresses. And so you could do that as well. We could just set that up on the addresses line. And as I mentioned before, you can use square brackets. So we could do something like 10.0.2.53 /24 and just comma separate the additional IP addresses that you want. Maybe you want 2 IP addresses on here and close the square brackets. So that's one way to do that if you want to have multiple IPs. And that could apply to DNS servers as well. Quite often you'll want more than one DNS server. You'll want a backup or a secondary DNS server. All right, so that is one example. I'm not actually going to complete this config, but we would save it. And then what we would do is we would go back to our command line and run a netplan apply. If you're not sure and you want to make sure it works first, you could do a netplan try. And if that does go through and it shows no configuration errors in your configuration file, then you can do a netplan apply. If we did that here, we'd lose our connection because we're SSH'd in. So you might want to do that within the actual console. All right, so that's just a little bit about changing static IP and how you do it on an Ubuntu server, just a little bit extra stuff for this video. But the server is installed and it's ready to do what we want to do here. And we can configure it through SSH. We can ping out to the internet. You can see we're getting replies here. We can install programs with apt install and so on. So that's pretty much it for this video. And that's the installation of Ubuntu. Go to work, get your own Ubuntu server, and don't forget to check out those other installation options where you can automatically provision VMs and provision for bare metal systems. All right, that's it. Have a good one.